My name is Randall Kennedy. I teach at Harvard Law School, and I'd like to welcome everybody to this event this evening. Welcome everyone to the forum and the Kennedy School of Government. There's an interesting panel planned for you this evening on the following question: can the Black-Jewish coalition be effective in the new Congress? And we have four very distinguished speakers who are going to address themselves to that question. After they speak for a few minutes, the forum will be open to your questions, and we look forward to a healthy, vigorous, open exchange of views. Our first speaker is Congressman Barney Frank, Democrat, from Massachusetts, who first came to the Congress in 1981. Congressman Frank.
Thank you. I was very pleased when Len Zakim from the Anti-Defamation League asked me to help in putting this together, and I was very gratified when two of my most respected colleagues, John Lewis and Alcy Hastings, agreed to come. And I invited them because we worked together in the House of Representatives on a Black-Jewish ongoing coalition. Obviously, this gets attention because over the past years there have been some frictions between Black and Jewish leaders and Black and Jewish communities. And these are realities that should be dealt with. It is our feeling, however, that given the kind of mood in the country now and recently, disproportionate attention gets given to negatives. And we think it's especially important now, those of us who are working together here in Congress, because we are in the Black and Jewish delegations not exclusively Democratic, but overwhelmingly Democratic. We feel, particularly this year, that values that we all share are very much at risk in the political process of the United States, and that's strengthened our coming together. The first point that I want to stress, however, is that what you have between the Black and Jewish groups in Congress is a natural alliance. No one sat down and said, hey, let's put a Black-Jewish thing together. It just became clear to me when I got to Congress in 1981 that there were a broad range of issues when Black and Jewish members voted together. And I think one thing is very clear, and I've seen this with regard to gay and lesbian issues and with regard to issues involving women. The experience of having been discriminated against in this society produces some common understandings. Among other things, we share a real unhappiness when people start talking about imposing an orthodoxy on us, because we don't think it's going to be one that's going to be especially representative of either of our interests. And what I want to stress is that the Black-Jewish cooperation that goes on in Congress is overwhelming. I think if you were to do a statistical analysis, somebody's looking for a paper to do, we'd all love to see the results. We'll even promise to put it in the congressional record, although you lose your copyright when we do that. I would guess, I would be surprised if it wasn't in this. Take any significant demographic group, gender, religion, race, age, any of the large statistical categories, geography, you will find that Black and Jewish members of Congress vote together more often than any other groups. We have a common commitment to a set of principles, to a view that the government has a positive role to play in offsetting the inequalities and unfairnesses that will inevitably rise from the best-run private sector system. Yeah, we're committed to a private sector, and we understand that's where the wealth will come from, but we also believe that even the best functioning private sector is going to generate problems of inequality and unfairness that a compassionate society will respond to through government. We have a great common interest in civil liberties, in protecting people's freedoms to dissent, in protecting procedural fairness. And I guess the way it seems to me to have worked after 15 years is that because we had a natural alliance on so many things, that's included, by the way, and we talked earlier about the question of school prayer. Now, for many Jewish Americans, resisting the notion that the school should be instruments for inculcating religion is very important. It's partly self-interest. I mean, most Jews understand, even some of the very Orthodox Jews who believe very strongly that there ought to be a greater role for religion in education, tend to believe that, therefore, you should go to a Jewish school. They are not very hopeful that if the public schools decide to institute prayer, it'll be Shema Yisrael. And they're a little bit skeptical of any other. Most genuinely religious people are a little bit skeptical of the one-size-fits-all version of prayer. It does not have the kind of content that they're looking for. But when school prayer and the separation of church and state, not for the denigration of religion, but so that each has its proper sphere, when we debate those, and there have been clergymen who have stood up on the floor to argue for the separation of church and state during my time, those clergymen have been African-American ministers. They have been Bill Gray and others who were members of the clergy who had stronger credentials for arguing that than almost anybody else. But we have, out of this, I think, common commitment to a compassionate government, out of a recognition that discrimination is possible and you have to guard against it, has come a recognition of common interest. And we have then worked to build on this. And let me just close my presentation, because we want to maximize the time, obviously, for talking among ourselves, with a discussion of what's going on with two very important issues, which are, within the broader community, sometimes seen as divisive issues. And that's Israel and Africa. And I understand, within the intellectual community, there are arguments about Israel and Africa. In fact, in the United States House of Representatives, black members of the House and Jewish members of the House have collaborated very strongly on trying to promote policies that are representative of the interests of both communities in good relations and supportive relations between the United States, Africa, and Israel. And I'll give you one specific example. Let me speak here now as a Jew to many Jewish Americans who will read some black intellectuals being very critical of Israel. Look at the record of African-American members of the House of Representatives when it comes to foreign assistance, when it comes to other things which are important to the state of Israel. And you find overwhelming support. On the other side, you have found Jewish members being particularly in the forefront, second to the African-Americans who understandably took the lead, as Jewish members have taken the lead on Israel, with regard to liberating South Africa. And it has been black and Jewish members who did that. And I want to give one example, which didn't get a lot of attention. Sometimes I'm critical of the press, but this one we didn't want to get a lot of press. A few years ago, there was a State Department report came out, mandated by Congress, that listed countries that had been doing arms business with South Africa. And Israel, to the chagrin of many of us, was in there. Now, we had urged the Israeli government to change. There were problems which grew out of the fear of the Israeli government that Jewish South Africans were being held hostage. There was a history there that some of us understood but wanted to see changed. We believe that we had some commitments which were later carried out by the Israeli government to change that policy. And this was the Likud government under Prime Minister Shamir. Clearly, there was a prospect for a lot of anguish and yelling. Jews criticizing the State Department for daring to criticize Israel. Blacks being very unhappy about Israel having done this. And the black and Jewish members decided that our mutual assistance to each other and the shared values which drove us together were too important to be jeopardized. And we had a meeting and decided that a joint delegation of black and Jewish members would meet with the Israeli government. Prime Minister Shamir happened to be in town. And in fact, there was supposed to be a breakfast with the Jewish members, and we said, we'll give up our time. We think this meeting is important. The Israeli government said, no, we agree it's important. We will find time. And the delegation of members met and came to a very useful agreement. And the leader in the African-American community at that time in Congress on this issue was Ron Dellums. I don't know how many of you know both Ron Dellums and Prime Minister Shamir, but I have described this previously as an eyeball-a-puppic meeting in which they managed to work out all their differences. And as a result, there have been no further frictions. The Israeli government was not at all an obstacle in the future. There were no problems, and we worked it out together. And we did it because the black and Jewish members have seen each other as our friends. Now, There are two sources of tension, and I want to talk about it in my final point. One, yes, there are natural tensions. It's interesting, the natural tensions are partly there because there is an expectation that we're supposed to be closer together. In fact, tensions between blacks and Italians, Jews and Greeks, you can get any other combination you want. Other white people and blacks, Jews and Filipinos. I mean, there are all manner of ethnic conflicts you can focus on. For historical reasons, in part, black-Jewish conflicts get the most attention, but there's another reason, and a more insidious one that I want to address. Part of the problem between blacks and Jews has resulted from a deliberate effort on the part of some very conservative people, including a handful in the Jewish community, to try to move Jews to the right. And I remember reading one article by Irving Kristol. It was a fascinating article to be defending Jews because, among other things, he said, well, actually, this was in a debate. He and I were debating, and he said, well, why are we objecting that when they say it's a Christian nation? It is a Christian nation, and we ought to accept that. Ralph Reed of the Christian Coalition says we shouldn't call it a Christian nation. But Irving Kristol was prepared to concede that. I've always had trouble with the notion of a Christian nation. Myself, one time, a little aside, I happened to be presiding over the House of Representatives on school prayer once the Senate had voted on a school prayer amendment, voted it down, and Tip O'Neill wasn't going to let it come up in the House. And he thought it would embarrass some Democrats. And so the Republicans had an all-night special order, speeches on prayer. They had prayer envy, and the Senate could talk about it, and they wanted to talk about it. And so it was relatively early in my congressional career, and the Democrats had to preside. The majority party gets to preside over the House. So I was assigned from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. to preside over the House. This is a big honor to be in the House from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. It's slightly less of an honor than painting the fence. And I happened to be there about 6:30 in the morning, and a member of Congress, she's no longer with us as a member of Congress, Marjorie Holt, a Republican from Maryland, said, Mr. Speaker, we must have school prayer to demonstrate that this is a Christian nation, which, of course, some of us had thought was the real agenda for people who were pushing it. And I couldn't say anything, I was in the chair, but afterwards a reporter called me up and said, gee, how did you feel, being Jewish, sitting in the chair when she said this is a Christian nation? And I said, I'll tell you exactly what occurred to me. If this is such a Christian nation, why'd they have to get some poor Jew out of bed at 6 o'clock and make him sit here? And she went on to say, by the way, we talked about this before, that she didn't mean a Christian nation, she meant it was a Judeo-Christian nation. I said, look, you may think I'm picking on it. I said to her privately, it's not a Judeo-Christian nation, it's not a Judeo-Christian, Islamo-Budo, Shinto nation. It is a do-whatever-you-want nation, which includes being religious or not religious. And I said before, I am very skeptical when I hear Judeo-Christian. I have never met a Judeo-Christian. And if I do, I have one question to ask her. How will she spend this weekend, Easter or Pesach? But the problem is that some of the neoconservative Jewish Democrats have been perplexed for some time that Jews vote too liberal. This bothers them. And they think it is important to move Jews to a more conservative position. That's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. People can argue that people should vote a different way. What I have found intellectually illegitimate and morally troubling is the effort to say Jews as Jews shouldn't vote so liberal. And Irving Kristol, in effect, wrote an article that said, what are we hanging around with these black people for, politically? We don't have anything in common with them. Let's go to our true allies, the more conservative people. And I think that kind of argument willfully distorted the facts. Because I remember at the time there was a resolution calling on the United States government to recognize Jerusalem as the capital. At that point, not complicated by the kind of ongoing negotiations. And the overwhelming number of black members of Congress were co-sponsors of that resolution. And there were motions to cut out aid to Israel, and the overwhelming majority of members on the black caucus had voted for it. In fact, the closeness of the relationship between blacks and Jews is not some artificial construct cooked up in a liberal laboratory somewhere. It is a natural outflow of shared values and the shared experience of discrimination, and in fact has been reinforced by a natural interest in each other's major concerns, and because those of us in politics recognize that, an effort to really kind of hammer those home. Now, I recognize that the issues we deal with in national politics, where we have this unity, are not the only issues. And there are other issues in an intellectual context which are a problem. Let me close with this. If you look at those issues which are real issues in American politics, those where there's some real doubt about the outcome, I think you will find black and Jewish mainstreams overwhelmingly allied. And I can tell you as a fact that black and Jewish members of the House of Representatives find themselves overwhelmingly allied. Yes, there are issues that divide blacks and Jews. They tend to be issues that are somewhat at the fringe of politics, issues that we haven't reached yet. Maybe liberalism will be so successful 20 years from now we'll get to fight about those issues. I'll look forward to that. But until then, when you look at the Republican majority in the House of Representatives and its agenda, and where the Republican Party is likely to be in 1996, when Phil Gramm has the ability to yank Bob Dole to the right anytime he feels like, the kinds of issues that will be cutting-edge issues in American politics for the foreseeable future are overwhelmingly going to be the issues where black and Jewish Americans, not every one of us obviously, have common interests, common values, and a common purpose. And so I hope that as we fight about the other issues, and there will be disagreements, people will understand the importance of that, recognize that it's a natural construct, and work to try and keep it together. Thank you.
Congressman Frank, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Congressman John Lewis, Democrat from Georgia, who entered the Congress in 1987. Congressman Lewis.
Thank you very much, Professor Kennedy. Let me just say that I'm delighted and very happy and very pleased to be here with two of my colleagues from the House of Representatives and with the Executive Director of the ADL. It is good to be here at this great institution. I think Barney said all that needed to be said, but everybody haven't said it. That's what Mo Udall used to say. So, Barney, I'm going to try to be a little shorter, but I want to thank my a good friend and my colleague in the House, Barney Frank, for inviting me to come to this great state, to come to this great city. I've been knowing Barney Frank for a long time. Another time when he was a little lighter, and when I had all of my hair and a few pounds lighter also, we were together a little more than 30 years ago during the Mississippi Summer Project in 1964, when more than 1,000 young people came to the state of Mississippi to participate in voter registration effort. And a large number of those young people were Jewish. And I said to a group earlier tonight, two of the young people that died in Mississippi that were arrested, beaten, taken to jail, taken out of jail, beaten, shot and killed, two young Jews and one black, Andy Goodman, Mickey Schwerner, and James Schranger. So we've come a distance since then. We have struggled together, and today many of us are in the Congress together. So I come here today, tonight, to report to you that the state of Black-Jewish relation in the 104th Congress is as strong as ever. In fact, in the face of a conservative right-wing agenda that threatens both communities, the relationship may be stronger than ever before. In preparation for this evening discussion, Barney and I did a little research. I wanted to see on some of the key issues of the day, how did the voting records of black and Jewish members of the Congress compare? I looked at just three issues, three of the most contentious issues from the Republican contract with America, what I like to call their contract on America. The three issues were the balanced budget amendment, welfare reform, and the Republican tax cut plan. Let me share with you my findings. The balanced budget amendment 89% of the Black Caucus, and 68% of the Jewish members of Congress opposed the contract item. This compared with just 31% of the Congress overall. Welfare reform, 95% of the Black Caucus and 84% of the Jewish members opposed the Republican welfare package. This compared with 46% of the Congress overall. And finally, the tax cut package, 95% of the CBC and 88% of the Jewish members opposed the Republican tax cut proposal. This compared with just 43% of the overall Congress. One issue after issue, vote after vote, Black and Jewish members showed their common interests and shared belief. Black and Jewish members of Congress have perhaps the most similarity in their voting records of any two identifiable groups in the Congress. The Black and Jewish coalition is alive, and it is well. Additionally, last year on the issue of foreign aid, an issue of obvious importance to the Jewish community, there was unanimous support in favor of aid among the members of the Congressional Black Caucus. This is largely a reflection of the close relationship between African American and Jewish members and the efforts of the Jewish community to educate CBC members to the importance of foreign aid to Israel and to American Jews. And I just might say, last year, it was my great pleasure and delight to lead a group of new Black members to Israel. And I believe my colleague and my friend from Florida, Congressman Hastings, is going to lead a group of Black members to Israel later this year during the July 4th break.
July 4th.
But while there's great unity and common interest between Blacks and Jewish members of Congress, there will no doubt be issues on which we disagree. The issue of affirmative action may be one such issue, for I'm hopeful that we will find common ground when this issue is fully discussed and debated. I'm confident, however, that whatever the outcome, the dialogue between Blacks and Jewish members will be intelligent, thoughtful, and respectful. As Barney suggested, it is unfortunate that there are those who will use this issue as the Willie Horton of the 1996 campaign. It does not serve the best interests of Blacks or Jewish relation or race relation in a broader society to politicize this sensitive issue. It is just plain and dead wrong. Those who would exploit racial tension and divide our country for personal political gain are not worthy to hold public office. The greatest challenge, I believe, facing the effectiveness of the Black Jewish coalition in the 104th Congress will be the right-wing agenda of Newt Gingrich and his Christian coalition-backed colleagues. As the numbers I shared with you earlier suggest, the Black Jewish coalition will be effective in providing a strong and mighty voice. We will be part of the loyal opposition. As a participant in the civil rights movement of the 1960s, I know firsthand the political and social power of American Blacks and Jews working side by side toward the same goals. As a member of Congress, working side by side with Barney Frank and other Jewish colleagues, I know firsthand the political and legislative victories we can achieve in helping to create a more just society. So I tell all of you here tonight, all of you who are committed to better and stronger Black-Jewish relations, don't give up, don't give out, don't give in. Don't get lost in a sea of despair. Better days are ahead. Working together, we can build a better world. In a real sense, I think as Blacks and as Jews who know something about struggle and something about suffering, we have to say over and over again that we are one nation, one community, one people, one house, the American house. We are one family, the American family. It is my conviction that as we continue down this dusty and sometimes muddy road in the 104th Congress, the black and Jewish members will keep their eyes on their prize. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congressman Lewis. Our next speaker is Congressman Alcy Hastings, Democrat from Florida, who entered the Congress in 1992. Congressman Hastings.
Thank you, Professor Kennedy, and thank all of you for coming out here this evening. I'm especially indebted to my colleague Barney Frank for asking myself and John. Mr. Zakim, I don't know who asked you to come, but I gather since you're with the Anti-Defamation League that you helped to ask us to come, and we're grateful to you for that, as well as the Du Bois Institute. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. Barney and John have advanced me in a way that makes it a bit difficult, and even more so for the final speaker. But rising to the task, I hearken to urge upon you the fact that I'm coming straight to you from the airport. And I was picked up by a very nice gentleman, and we got into dialogue. I've been traveling since 1:30 this afternoon. I told Mayor Kelly I had to stop in Washington and couldn't even go to my apartment en route here. Got here, recognized that it was late, didn't go to the hotel, came here because I wanted to be on time. Talking with this young man, we got into the typical conversation. He was a young white gentleman, and telling him I was from Florida and everything, he says, I tell you, he said, I was down there, down in the South the other day. I was in North Carolina, and I know all about the South, he says, and you being a black fella, so I don't know how you all can put up with some of the things in the South. I say, are you talking about South Boston or Southern United States? I mean, I wasn't so sure that I was in the right cab at that point in time, or right vehicle. You know, Barney, if I can segue off of your comments about what a Judeo-Christian might very well do on this upcoming weekend, I gather that she would eat leavened bread and chitlins and collard greens, or something along those lines. This acculturation brings into mind my personal experience of going from fried chicken and collard greens to roast beef mit schmaltz, and wondering how it is. Now, you and John probably wondered why I had that quintuple bypass. It was for the reason that I've been eating a lot of chicken fat in my life, as it is. The question is, can the Black-Jewish Coalition be effective in the new Congress? Let me make it very clear. It has been effective for a substantial number of Congresses, and the resounding answer to that question is yes, it will be, because there are people there like Barney Frank and John Lewis and myself and countless others who are involved on an ongoing basis to ensure that we foster good relations between each other. And as Barney has so aptly put it, it is not an artificial construct. We come together because of great needs that we share and vital interests that are of concern to all of us in this country. The backdrop, and what I think is proper to pivot off of to bring us into this consanguine kind of posture, would be, if nothing more, the awesomeness of history's teaching what happened to Jews during the Holocaust and what happened to African ancestor persons during slavery. And I think it's from there that we draw our commonality, and it is for the many reasons that history continues to give us reasons that we would get together. But like any relationship, it needs to be nurtured. As one who is twice divorced, I recognize a lack of nurturing on my behalf in either of those relationships, and I also recognize that I'm not likely to need that nurturing anymore either. But we could go in different directions, and find ourselves at least mindful of great responsibilities that we have toward each other. I had the good fortune last year, and I guess in some respects it might not be considered good fortune, but within 2 months I went from Auschwitz to Ghana. And in each place I had the exact same feeling. For in Auschwitz, I know that people that had been there had been subjected to the most unkind kind of punishment that humankind could envision. And then in Ghana, following that, where the slaves left, and I know that Barney and John have had this experience, I could not help but hearken back to that feeling that I had in Auschwitz when I stood on the shores of where African ancestors left and were brought here. There's an abundance of precedents that shows that blacks and Jews have more in common than they do not have in common. If I hearken to a day when I was not in the Congress and had no notion that I would be there, Gary Ackerman from New York and Mickey Leland from Houston, Texas, were busying themselves working on behalf of hunger for people around the world, but with Africa as the specific area that they were vitally interested in. Mickey Leland lost his life in that fight. They had already been one place, and Mickey wanted to go to yet another place where people thought that he should not go, and cautioned him that he shouldn't, and the plane crashed. It was Gary Ackerman on that same Ethiopian Airlines charter plane when they said, turn around, he says, no, I'm going to find my friend. And he found his soul brother and was the cause of Mickey's body, as well as the others who were killed in that crash, being found. Toward those ends, it's hard to envision that there will not always be those relationships. And as John has aptly put it, there will be disagreements. But we have fundamental interests. And I, for one, am fostering in this year's Congress, in the 104th, greater concern by African American and Jewish congresspersons to the needs of foreign aid as it pertains to the rise of extremism in North Africa and in West Africa. When I went to the Sudan, and don't too many people go to the Sudan, when I went there and learned that there were 16 terrorist camps, since there are 21, then I recognize that a lot of us have a vital interest in making sure that the fomenting seeds of fundamentalism from an Islamist point of view, let me make it very clear, let's don't dump on anybody's religion. The religion Islam is peopled by outstanding individuals. It is that there is a core that is a distinct minority that are about the business of operating with the jihad as a concept that they find themselves offering for the world. And that kind of extremism doesn't stop in Gaza. It doesn't stop in Khartoum. It doesn't stop in Argentina. It doesn't stop in New York. It stops somewhere in the hearts of all of us if we think about it, because on any given occasion, any of us could be injured as a result of saying. I spoke recently, as did John on that day. Barney, I don't know whether you did, but the Jewish Federation had a come-in day to advance and listen to us. And I spoke to them, and a question was put to me afterward. It was on the day that in the New York Times, Ralph Reed of the Christian Coalition had offered an olive branch to Jews and had indicated that he felt that there should be a greater coalescing. And so a gentleman asked me what did I think about that, and whether or not I thought that Jews should trust Ralph Reed and the Christian Coalition. I told him I would not be so presumptuous as to suggest who should trust whom. But I know if it is that I am to be in the business of trusting Ralph Reed, then count me out. I don't know about anybody else, and you tell Ralph Reed when you see him, I said so. And I said about Ralph Reed and Pat Robertson, Christian that I am, African Methodist Episcopal that I am, if I happen to go to something called heaven, if it happens to exist, and I find either of them there, I'm going to ask for a damn transfer immediately. You understand? So my answer signifies how strongly I feel. I'm past that point any longer in my life where I'm going to be an apologist or tolerant of people who are intolerant of me. And no matter what mask they put on it, I'm no longer going to allow for any individual that I know of, be he black or white, male or female, or of any gender, if they find themselves in a position of preaching hatred, count me out. I'm not going to be involved in that kind of activity. So those wedge issues that we are going to be confronted with, affirmative action, school prayer, or flag desecration, allows that the blacks and Jews in Congress are going to work through those issues because we are the intelligentsia and we are responsible enough to recognize that we have a determined interest that crosses more common understandings than uncommon beliefs. And we will not let myth avoid the reality of our great need to work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Congressman Hastings. Our final speaker is Mr. Leonard Zakim, the Executive Director of the Anti-Defamation League of New England, and we look forward to his remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm very privileged to be on a panel with three elected congressmen, one who happens to be mine, and I'm proud that Barney Frank is our congressman and is, I think, the best congressman there is. All of the speakers referred to the effort by some people to divide us, and it has long been in the interest of these people to keep us from being confused with the facts. And I think my perspective on this panel is to really, I think, emphasize and enhance the facts that these gentlemen talked about. And it reminded me of a story that a friend of mine tells, a preacher, Reverend Stith, talks about two folks who go camping on a trip, and they're out there and they're cooking the meal around the campfire and everything, and then they get ready to go to bed, and the fire's still smoldering a bit, and the smell of food is permeating through the air, and all of a sudden they're in their sleeping bags, and they hear this scratching at the tent. And they look up and they see this big grizzly bear starting to get through their tent to get at the food. So the two of them head out of the tent, and they run as fast as they can. One of them stops to put on his sneakers. And the other one says to the first one, says, "What are you putting on your sneakers for? You're not going to be able to outrun that bear." And the person putting on the sneakers says, "I don't need to outrun the bear. I only have to outrun you." Right? And I think there is an effort. There's an effort abroad, sometimes from within our community, but mostly from without our community, for people who take a look at this relationship that has survived all the premature obituaries written about it, has survived legitimate differences of opinion, hard frictions in some areas, but yet survived because I think we subscribe to the inescapable network of mutuality that Dr. King spoke about. And we don't do it in symbolic terms, we do it in facts. We do it in specific projects. We do it not just in rhetoric, but in working together despite the efforts of people. I mean, few subjects provoke as much intense controversy in this country as black-Jewish relations. Few issues ignore the positive and emphasize the negative as much as black-Jewish relations. Few issues distort and romanticize the history of a relationship that nostalgia, amnesia, and fantasy take over where reality once walked than the subject of black-Jewish relations. The subject is a virtual minefield with its parameter dictated by a lazy press, uninvolved and uninformed scholars and analysts, eloquent and bigoted demagogues, and a high degree of misinformation amongst our two communities about each other. And we literally face, I think one of the reasons we're doing this panel tonight, we literally face a tidal wave of negative information surrounding black-Jewish relations. If you defend its fundamental importance or its continuing relevance, it's almost as if you're getting in front of a moving train and stopping it with your hands. Successful stories of black-Jewish collaboration rarely get any hype, and they rarely get heard. They're sometimes dismissed as sentimental or liberal. Misinformation and ignorance get incorporated into articles about black-Jewish relations written by people, both black and Jewish, who rarely interact with each other, and for years have not been involved in black-Jewish collaborations, if they ever were involved. Anecdotes become popular folk tales. One group of black kids amongst the tens of thousands of black kids who went to see Schindler's Lists laughs in California, and that becomes all black kids to so-called writers like Jacob Neusner, who recently wrote a piece in Midstream magazine saying black kids don't understand what happened to the Holocaust. A small group of Jews who went and tried to break into Jesse Jackson's presidential headquarters here in Boston, the Jews Against Jackson they called themselves, become to many blacks all Jews. And I think that we begin to accept generalizations about each other that we would reject if ever applied to ourselves. And this really goes to the way that we instinctively distrust the media. If you're a person of color in this country and it's an issue of color that the media is writing about, I think people have a genuine experience and reason to have some doubt as to the veracity of the coverage. If you're a Jewish person and you know something about the Arab-Israeli conflict, we have learned the hard way that you would distrust, kind of automatically at least, the kind of coverage that took place about the Arab-Israeli conflict. So why is it, with this inbred sense of distrust that has come about because of centuries of persecution, that we so quickly trust everything written against us or about us by people who don't know anything about it? This is something that I think we need to deflate. I think it's something that myths and inaccuracies are rarely challenged by people who know better. When 90% of African Americans in Chicago rejected the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories of the aide to the mayor of Chicago, Steve Coakley, who came up with the great idea of the version of the blood libel that Jewish doctors were responsible for injecting AIDS into black children. 90% of African Americans in Chicago supported his termination and spoke out against him, and yet everywhere it said blacks didn't speak out. 90% is a pretty good rating. Ask any politician seeking office. 90% is a pretty good percentage. Why was it that so few people took the time to read the Chicago Sun-Times, the Chicago Tribune poll? Other polls show the majority of people who subscribe to Farrakhan on some issues also reject or specifically criticize anti-Semitism. And as much as that issue continues to be a cause of focus, that little piece never gets discussed. And therefore, black people feel put upon always as if they have to speak up and represent Mr. Farrakhan whenever they have a dialogue on black-Jewish issues. And that's a cause that I don't think is fair to impose, as if every Jewish person was responsible for everything a Jewish person did as well. We've got to get beyond that. And I think what these folks up here enable us to do on a daily level is to get to the issues that really affect the black and Jewish relationship. And I think that on that note, I want to talk about just quickly some of those issues. Healthcare, housing, education, affirmative action, social justice, jobs, women's rights, human rights, civil rights. As Congressman Lewis showed, on vote after vote, these are two communities that are really sticking together at incredibly disproportionate numbers. Now, maybe this relationship is strong as most in a Congress, but I don't buy that either. Because across this country, blacks and Jews are working. We're not working just on saying that we believe in this mutuality. We're talking about mortgage discrimination, mostly against people of color. And Barney Frank, as a member of the Housing Subcommittee, was one of the leading people to speak up about that issue. We're talking about divestment from South Africa a few years ago, led by African Americans, but supported by people like Howard Wolpe and others. We're talking about issues of support to Israel, led by members of the Congressional Black Caucus, when Jews felt very much alone, particularly after the war in Lebanon. We're talking about continued, not just gestures, but evidence of serious support. So why is it that people are so interested in acting as if this doesn't happen? Part of it is, I think, that the past relationship creates expectations that it wouldn't be fair for anyone to have to live up to. Part of it is that romance and nostalgia. Part of it is that people don't care about Jewish-Greek relations or black Puerto Rican relations. But they do care about black-Jewish relations. And I think in caring about that, we have an opportunity to speak out and to talk about the issues that bring us together. We have a responsibility to reject indifference. We have a responsibility, all of us, those who are elected leaders and those of us who are community leaders, to interrupt prejudice whenever we hear it. And when we hear people tell lies about each other, we need to be the voices that raise it. And I think that's very true whether it's about ourselves or about others. And that's not rhetoric either. That's something that some people find very difficult to find. They can give great speeches. But when it comes to stopping their friends or family from repeating anti-Semitic or racist stereotypes or myths, all of a sudden they become silent. The hardest fight for civil rights today still starts at home, still starts in your own districts, still starts with your own supporters, and then goes to the folks who don't share our views and our values. What we have up here is the opportunity with 3 congresspeople who have really taken the risk to stand out on a limb and say, we support these issues. We're here to speak truth to justice, speak truth to power. We're here to make clear that out there in those communities where misinformation is pervasive, they want to talk about what's really happening. That's our interest at ADL. That's what we've been doing in building coalitions across this area on all kinds of issues. And I hope that the following discussion will give us the opportunity to realize the real truth about I think Dr. King's most prophetic statement. That was that when he said that if we don't learn to live together as brothers and sisters, we will perish together as fools. Let me tell you something. If we agree 90% of the time on most issues and disagree on 10%, we are the fools if we allow other people to divide us and not understand that a good part of this country doesn't agree on the 10% of the 90% that we already are committed to. Thank you.
What we'd like to do is to have the panelists entertain questions. There's microphones here, and when you do ask a question, would you please identify yourself? I think I'd like to start things off by asking the following. How representative do you think you all are? I mean, it's one thing for people in Congress, and by the way, I mean, the lineup here is we have 3 liberals, 3 Democrats, 3 people who are affluent. The same applies to your colleagues. Yes, affluent. The same applies to your colleagues.
Professor can't see.
I mean, I could imagine a scenario in which maybe you all being able to get together and interact in the way in which you've described, that happens, but maybe that's the easy case. What happens back in your home districts, where I would suppose that, for instance, with respect to class, if it's a home district where a very large percentage of the constituency is Jewish, there's one class basis. If a home district is predominantly black, I would suppose that the socioeconomic indices would be considerably different. So it's not that I disagree with anything that you stated, but I have the suspicion that we've heard the happy version of the story. So how do you respond?
Look, Bernie, well, in my case, I represent the greater metropolitan Atlanta. My district includes almost all of the city, but I have parts of 3 suburban counties and other small towns and communities. I think I am the personification of my district. I think that people in the 5th District of Georgia, blacks and Jews, share my position on black and Jewish relations. And in Atlanta, long before I became a congressperson, there had been a long history of blacks and Jews working and building together. So I think I'm a reflection of that. I don't think I'm out there just sort of leading. I may lead because at one time in my other life, long before being a congressperson, I did co-chair something called the Black Jewish Dialogue. But I don't get people writing me and saying, John Lewis, why are you going to Israel? Why are you taking this position? You may have 1 or 2 student types, 1 or 2 so-called radical, but I think leaders must lead. You cannot put your finger in the air and see which way the wind is blowing. You have to take a position. Then this is it. This is right. Let's do it.
I agree with John. Let me say, obviously, we're better at maybe getting along. That's what we do for a living. But first, I am very much convinced the electoral system works to this extent. You do not long stay in office if you are not generally representative of your people. The one, and I think it's a very fair question, but there's one statistical point I would challenge, though. We are, in fact, representative of the black and Jewish members. And that says something about what we're saying. That is, if you were to draw randomly from the black and Jewish members, yes, we're all liberal Democrats. so are 98% of the black members and 85% of the Jewish members. I mean, that's the fact. There are, I think, 3 Jewish Republicans now, and 2 black Republicans. The Jewish Republicans tend to be more liberal. Maybe there's 4. I'm trying to think of one new one. But overwhelmingly, we are statistically representative. And if I had just chosen randomly from my African-American colleagues, it wouldn't have been greatly different in the kind of things we are talking about. I mean, you heard John's statistics. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I think we are broadly representative of our districts in this regard. In fact, I would say the points of friction tend to be, and they're there obviously, but John said students. Yes, there's a good deal of friction at the intellectual level, and that is the function of intellectuals in the society. In fact, to sharpen differences and to focus on differences. But I think many of the historiographical issues that intellectuals tend to argue about are not part of the mainstream living experiences of most people, and we are reflecting at the national level what happens with the issue. So I do think this is, I mean, that's our point. Sure, there are some fights. We said this, even on affirmative action. Yeah, there's a difference on quotas, but beyond quotas, which we don't have very many of at the federal level, virtually none, when you talk about affirmative action, outreach and encouragement and et cetera, you will find black and Jewish members very much united there because, among other things, women in the Jewish community care a lot about affirmative action. And you will see in the fight to defend affirmative action properly understood, leadership from a lot of women from the Jewish community. So it's a reasonable question, but I don't think that we are exceptional in this case. And I do know this: I don't know of any Jewish or black political leader who has lost because he or she was considered to be too pro-black if Jewish and too pro-Jewish if black. And in fact, it went the other way around. I do recall, at least in the case of Philadelphia, Bill Gray actively intervened. Bill Gray, who'd been one of the leaders in black-Jewish cooperation, and I remember Bill saying that he helped defeat a state legislator, a black state legislator, who was actively anti-Semitic. And Bill said, we can't have this. And he took it to the streets and won the primary.
Right, and just a quick follow-up, and I will be brief. There are a few congresspersons who are Jewish who do not represent any blacks, and they're supportive of our issues. And it may be hard to believe, but there are black congresspersons, any number of them anymore, who represent hardly any Jews and are supportive of our issue. There's one thing you have to be mindful of. There's a new breed that has come up out of the South, and many of them represent, as do I, Jews and farm interests. I mean, you know, I have one ever more hellacious time balancing my condos with my sugarcane farmers. You understand what I'm saying? But it's there, it's real, it's my district.
Can I add one other point very briefly that I think makes the point that I meant to mention? Obviously, American voting patterns being what they are, if you're Jewish and you could pick voters, you'd pick more Jewish voters. And if you're African American and you could pick voters, you'd pick African American voters. But I believe we're each other's second choice. Yeah. I think if you are an African American and you say, look, we got bad news and good news. The bad news is that you're going to get a lot more white voters. But the good news is that they're Jewish. That would be generally acceptable. And similarly for us, you're getting a lot of new voters, but they're going to be black. Most of the Jews, you would find that probably these are groups that vote for each other's candidates. It was certainly the case when you had Harold Washington or others in mayoral elections. Unfortunately, remember, obviously, we're all part of America. There's racism. We're not arguing things are perfect, but within any white group, you're going to find that the Jews are going to be the most cooperative and vice versa.
There are a number of people at the microphones. We'll start here.
Hi, my name is Carmen Fields, and as a journalist, at the time I was a working journalist, my first memory of a strain, if you will, between blacks and Jews came around the Bakke decision. And there has been passing homage or mention of affirmative action as being a source of perhaps some agreement. And I'm just curious how each of you sees the coalition conducting itself, as this seems to be one of the hot button issues for Congress and the contract on America, how you see that playing out, or where the compromise between blacks and Jews how that will play out on the issue of affirmative action.
But I can answer that for you real quickly. The empirical data are going to reflect totally different things than the persons who are pushing up this agenda, such as a Robert Dole and a Phil Graham and a President Clinton, in my considered judgment, overreacting to the shots across the bow that he has seen on the subject of affirmative action. Our data is beginning to filter in, and once that data is on the table, and what I've called for is a lessening of our emotionalism and a paying attention to the actual real data, raw data, then what we're going to find is it's not as much of a problem as we tend to think it is. Those 300 lawsuits that were filed that were so-called reverse discrimination lawsuits, only a handful of them reached a court of law. And what we're going to find is the angry white male is going to have to find something else to get angry about.
Carmen, let me say the other, and I do think, to be explicit, yeah, on the question of if it's formal quotas in universities, you're going to have some differences of opinion. But as Alcy said, that's a very small part of what in fact happens. And at the federal level, and this is one thing that makes it easier for us, we don't do college admissions. I mean, college admissions are a major friction point if you've got hard quotas. Although what the Bakke court said was you could take race into account as a factor. And I don't think there's a lot of disagreement over it being a factor, and that diversity is a reasonable thing to look at. But
well,
that one happens
not to be, but there seems to be not as much greater consensus around that statement that you
well,
made
except
now
that if you look at
today
what's
as it
going
was
on,
10 years ago.
if you look at federal statutory policy, I mean, look, it's partly, and I agree, there are frictions. One of the things that makes it easier for us is that some of those frictional issues don't happen to reach us in Congress, and we're not denying that those issues are there, we're just saying don't let those destroy us, because Congress doesn't vote on college admissions. We have no quotas at the federal level for jobs. Yeah. We have some timetables and some goals. Those are not quotas, and anybody who doubts that they're quotas ought to look and say, because they're never met. I mean, we had a lot of goals, and the goals aren't met. The statistical, I mean, what Alcy is saying is overwhelmingly true. Anybody who tries to argue that white men have lost their jobs to blacks and women must be looking at some other country, because that just isn't true in the United States. It's technology, it's international competition, that are the problems. But in Congress, the hardest grained issue, the quota one, isn't there. And I tell you, we do understand there's some political problems with affirmative action, partly because it's been exaggerated. And you have a lot of people working in Congress, women are very much a part of this coalition, blacks, Jews, and others, trying to defuse the issue by talking about it. And the issues that we've got are just easy to deal with. So, I mean, if we were voting, should there or shouldn't there be quotas, hard quotas for university admissions, yeah, we'd have some differences of opinion. But that just doesn't become a federal issue.
I'd like to say in this debate, as it affects the community, we had something here in Massachusetts led by Diane Wilkerson, a state senator, just last week, a news conference of groups who came together to support the concept of affirmative action, to re-emphasize the fact that there is racism and sexism in this country, and that we should make every effort to make sure that people understand the disease, and let's get to the cure a little bit later and what it's going to entail. Along that group of people who were there, Carmen, was a traditional, almost 60s-like coalition with a lot of new groups, including women, people who were physically handicapped, veterans, etc. But the most important thing was that the 4 Jewish organizations in town, the national Jewish organizations, were there. And we spoke out. And we spoke out for affirmative action. And we did so not because we're so far ahead of our constituencies. Every public opinion poll conducted on this issue will show that short of the issue of quotas, which at the Leadership Conference of Civil Rights in Washington and right here, the issue is not quotas anymore. The issue is basically the whole issue of affirmative action. And if you take the issue of quotas out, affirmative action used to mean for a lot of people quotas. Now we have people, leadership from the African American Union, saying quotas isn't the issue. Cornel West said we're against quotas. Diane Wilkerson said we're against quotas. The Black Caucus said we're against quotas. We were talking about affirmative action, and there we were together, because that's one of the prime examples that if we agree 90% on the need for affirmative action, let other people quibble about that. But there's not even a consensus in this country for that. We showed that we're willing to stand up for it. And I think there were people who were shocked. I mean, I know the Banner is here tonight, and the Banner said to us, Bay State Banner said, well, isn't it kind of, it's odd that you're here, you know? And I think the fact that Jews who oppose quotas are willing to step up and take the fight for affirmative action is important, because it shows that, again, there is a substantial problem of racism that remains in this country, and we have to lift our voices for it. That should help us avoid the backy stuff. There may be some who want to exacerbate the conflict, but I think those people are really going to be on the fringe.
The question is, as a nation and as a society, are we committed to the idea of a truly interracial democracy in America? And is affirmative action a good policy, a program to move toward the creation of an open society, of what Martin Luther King Jr. called the beloved community? If we accept the idea that the scars and stains of racism are still deeply embedded in American society, and we use this as a tool, as an instrument to move us down this road, if this is our goal, I think we have to set it and continue to move in that direction. Another period in our history, not too long ago, as a nation, we had a policy to keep people out. It's to affirm the lack of participation. So we must affirm the inclusion, the participation of everybody. You open up to society. And that's what it's all about. And I think we got to continue to set up, and we cannot backtrack or slide back.
Yes, sir.
My name is Jim Tipton. I live here in Cambridge. I'd like to ask Mr. Lewis a question, but first I'd like to make a brief comment. Mr. Lewis, I take you back to when you were a little boy in Atlanta, maybe even before you were born. 60 years ago, I made friends. When I was assistant treasurer of Georgia Tech, I made personal friends with a great lady, Mrs. Grace Hamilton, who was working very actively with the Young Women's Christian Association. The Christian word has been used several times. At the same time, there were Jews who worked with people like Grace Hamilton as well, some of them the Anti-Defamation. My question is, first, one more subhead to that comment. At that time, most people that I knew personally, we had current conservatives in Atlanta and Georgia, but most would have been embarrassed to admit that they were Republican. There's been a great change since that time. And I'm wondering, now my question is, and others could speak to it if they can tie into it, but for Georgia, can you speak to your Republican colleagues from Georgia on these issues we've been talking about? One has not been mentioned, which I think should be, and that's the United Nations, the argument that we shouldn't help the United Nations anymore. Can you talk with your Republican colleagues on these?
Well, you know, a lot of these Republicans in Georgia, they weren't born. They moved from someplace else. I don't know.
I moved away.
Yeah, you moved away, and you created space for them to come in, and it is a real problem. It is a major problem. How to deal with this new movement, especially in the South, really. I think they just got to get religion. We got to continue to talk to them, preach to them.
But can you help give them that religion is what my...
Well, you know, I'm going to continue to do what I can, but it's going to be hard and very difficult. You know, some of these guys, I think we probably got to take them someplace in the religious sense and baptize them. Maybe one of my colleagues, maybe Mr. Hastings from Florida, since he got a lot of Republicans down in Florida. I was just about to say,
I suffer the same influx, so I certainly understand the dynamic as you presented. But to answer the question directly, we can talk with them, but they just don't listen. You understand? And we will continue to talk with them because we will not retreat. I think that they are wrong, and I will continue to tell them how and where they are wrong, and I think history will be our best judge. I said to someone the other day, in the initial rescissions that were put forward in Congress, the cutbacks, the $17 billion that everybody talked about, the first thing that was done was to address the most vulnerable people in our society. That was deliberate, and that's very Republican under the circumstances. I will continue to point that out, that they are addressing the most vulnerable people in our society. And what I said was, I wish we could transfer the pain in the morning. If we could transfer the pain real fast, their butts won't be in office very long, even in Georgia.
Hi, my name is Charles Glick. I'm a graduate of the Kennedy School and past co-chair of the Jewish Student Caucus here at the Kennedy School. And to quote Tip O'Neill, all politics is local. I think Tip O'Neill would also probably suggest that all coalition building happens on a personal relationship and at a local level. And I think it would be instructive, and while I applaud the work that's happening in Washington between the Black Congressional Caucus and Jewish members of Congress, I think it would be instructive to perhaps someone should highlight some of the successes that have been going on locally. I think Lenny Zakim is probably too modest to talk a little bit about the World of Difference Institute and the fact that a program that preaches tolerance in our public schools started here in Boston and now has national prominence, as well as the Jewish Community Relations Council here in Boston has a program with the 10-Point Coalition, Eugene Rivers and a group of ministers, where they have Boston Freedom Summer that took place last year and will take place this year. And even closer to home, not more than just a few hours ago, about 60, 70 students from this institution got together just across the courtyard over there for an interreligious, interethnic freedom Seder to talk about freedom, liberation, redemption from the perspective of all of our communities. And I wanted to let people know when they broke matzah together over that discussion, but I think it's instructive in terms of knowing that of all places, I think, in the country where we talk about coalition building and between blacks and Jews, I think it really starts from places like here, and I applaud you for the work that you're doing as well as the people here in this room.
Fabulous.
Hi, my name is Elliot Ratzman. I'm with the Harvard Divinity School Jewish Caucus and DSA at Harvard, and I just wanted to invite everybody to Cornell West and Michael Lerner are having their symbolic Blacks and Jews Let the Healing Begin 2 Mondays from now at MIT, and we have tickets available here if anyone's interested. So I guess that's my shameless self-promotion advertisement. But my question would be for the members of Congress. It seems that an overwhelming majority of Black and Jewish, at least leaders, give lip service, are progressive and liberal. It would seem that, though, that y'all are coming out of a generation which saw the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, some very hot politicizing issues. It seems that my generation doesn't seem to have the same sort of political chutzpah as y'all do. And I was wondering what the Jewish and Black caucuses might be doing or thinking about in terms of politicizing within the Jewish and Black community and reinvigorating the political and public sphere of my generation, and what could be done here locally. Lenny Zakim.
I'll defer to the members of Congress first.
Well, I will confess that I don't consider myself any great expert on how to get young people interested in politics if they're not already. What we can do is supply some of the factual ammunition for people who are working on that. And look, obviously moral fervor is a good thing, but a little self-interest don't hurt either. And that's part of what we want to talk about. I mean, I believe that you had the neoconservatives, Irving Kristol and others within the Jewish community, deciding that they really wanted to detach Jews from the liberal coalition for basic ideological reasons. And one thing they decided to do was to play on what they hoped would be Black Jewish fears and say, look, you're helping the enemy here, the blacks are your enemy, come over to this other side. And part of what we want to do, and how you use this, you're going to have to know better than I, but we do want to, I think we can give you the information and say, it's just not true, and in self-interest terms. I mean, let me talk now as someone who's Jewish and works in the Jewish community. I know that the right to choose an abortion, if pregnant, is a very important issue for many Jewish women. It's important for a lot of women. But I have found that there's a great fervor on the part of a lot of Jewish women. The notion of being told that they're not going to have this right is a very chilling one. The Congressional Black Caucus is overwhelmingly supportive of a woman's right to choose and has been strongly involved there. Separation of church and state is a very important issue for a lot of us, because we recognize that what people are talking about is using the coercive mechanism of the state to inculcate a religious orthodoxy that isn't going to be representative of our interests. And because of that same shared distaste of imposed orthodoxy, the Congressional Black Caucus has been very helpful to us. They have been very helpful to us on the whole question of foreign aid, on the question of trying now to provide aid to Jordan, which is critical for the security of Israel, because it's very important that we show Arab states in the Middle East that there's some gain to be gotten from making peace. And Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres have been urging people to support this. What we can say is, look, we know that people call each other names and people write articles about each other's history, and there are intellectuals on both sides and people on both sides who call each other names, and continue to do that, that's fine. But don't let that obscure the fact that when it comes to real issues that affect your lives, we have a great deal of benefit from our mutual relationship, and you shouldn't let that be spoiled. Now, how that translates in activating people, I don't know. And I wish I did, but I can't tell you that I'm an expert in how to get young people active in politics.
On the local side again, but I think with national implications, there's that if you want to be involved in coalition building, then the first thing you have to do is, of course, assume that the other side or other parties, potential parties, don't really understand what your position is on the issue. And reaching out to people and talking about shared concerns, for instance, about the budget cuts. I mean, it's not really been discussed that the impact of the contract, I like the contract on America better than the contract for America, but I think it's made us forget about the contract we're supposed to have with each other, the social contract. The contract that says that, as King said, that what affects one directly affects others indirectly. These cuts will seriously undermine the ability of institutions as diverse as Catholic Charities, Jewish federations, and social service organizations in the African American community, and in fact in any economically disadvantaged community, to do what many people are now assuming to be their birthright: Meals on Wheels programs, programs that affect aid to the elderly, programs that affect aid to education. So that if you're looking for issues, they may not be as sensationalistic or as exciting as marching in Mississippi. By the way, there's still issues down south, I think, that could probably generate other people to do a new Freedom Summer. But even in our own community here, there are threats that we may not see as black Jewish threats, but which affect us all as people. And that as you look around you, you'll find that people around the table on a variety of issues may be black and Jewish. Those are efforts to go forward. Those are the things that will go beyond the rhetoric. I think the issue, at least at the Harvard perspective or student perspective, is aid to education. The separation of church and state as it affects the federal financing of private schools. One of the statistics, by the way, that comes out in this recent vote, 90% of the Jewish delegation and 97% of the black delegation voted against federal funding of private schools, including parochial schools. Now, anybody who understands the future of America is very much rooted in good public education should not necessarily see that as a black Jewish issue, but yet it created an opportunity for a black Jewish coalition to work in Congress. Those same fights are going to be fought here in Massachusetts, as we do every year with a constitutional amendment that's led by the Senate President to finance parochial schools. There are opportunities to move forward. Some of it needs the responsibility of groups like ours to come out and maybe provide the menu. Let it be a smorgasbord. You come and pick what you want, but basically I think there are plenty of opportunities for coalition building that don't just happen when Leonard Jeffries comes to town or when some member of some party makes a remark that's considered to be divisive on the issues of black-Jewish relations. I think the coalition building starts there. It's worked. That's where it's going to continue to work.
As members of Congress, I don't think we can come here tonight with a roadmap, a blueprint, and say you do 1, 2, 3 or ABC. I think as young people, as students, I think we can come and maybe speak to a group of students, black students and Jewish students together. But when you see mutual interest and concern, or when you see example of racism, bigotry, anti-Semitism, this feeling that you have a moral obligation, a mandate, and a mission to do something about it, that you coalesce to fight it. In my own community, several organizations, several groups are working and building together young blacks and young Jews, young professionals, not just student groups, but people no longer in undergraduate school or graduate school, but people out in the work world coming together because, as Bernie suggested, it's in our best interest. There are forces in the American society that would like to see us divided. And I think these national forces want to try to use the whole question of race, affirmative action, or quotas, or whatever you want to call it, to divide people because they think they can win, get a cheap victory. And in the process, it would destroy our society, I think.
I just will be very brief. The movements that have been great movements that came off of college campuses came off of college campuses. They didn't come from congressional leaders and or individuals of prominence. Generally, what happened is individuals of prominence heard the cry and then rode the wave at that point. And the thing that has been constantly on my mind, I went to college in 1953, and I know that my generation was the silent generation. I mean, we didn't say nothing, but the reason we didn't say nothing was because you would die if you said something. Well, lo and behold, we got to the 90s and the late 80s, and damn it if y'all ain't as silent as we were on college campuses. I don't know what it is. You need unifiers, I guess, but it's very troubling that you don't find issues that you can rally around university to college to university to college throughout this nation, as we did around a number of issues, recognizing the difference in generations.
Yes.
Hello, my name is John Simon. I'm a master's student here at the Kennedy School. I'm somewhat in awe because there are few public officials I respect as much as John Lewis, whereas many are trying to make it into the history books. He's already there. To that extent, I was somewhat dismayed when he referred to the Republican welfare reform bill using terms such as Nazi and Holocaust in two ways. One, as a Republican, I was dismayed because I believe, while as misguided as you may think it is, it's a good faith effort to attempt to address some serious problems in our country's welfare system. But even more so as a Jew, I believe that the Holocaust should be invoked very rarely when compared to current circumstances. I think there are circumstances in the world that merit that invocation, but I think they're few and far between, and I'm wondering, am I oversensitive, and were members of the Jewish delegation similarly sensitive, or did they not see it as I did?
Well, let me respond. I tried to say in that statement, it was a very moving and heated discussion going on. I had been I sit on the Ways and Means Committee of the House, and we have in the Congress now a lot of young Republicans from the other side. I don't want to be too partisan here tonight. On the other side of the aisle, and it came to a point during the debate on welfare reform and some other issues that I just became a little, what Fannie Lou Hamer would call, sick and tired of being sick and tired, hearing some of these young guys. And at one point, I said to one of the young guys from the far west or Midwest someplace, I said, you don't understand. I don't want to insult you, but you don't understand. I said, you weren't even born. You really don't understand. I said, the scars and stain of racism are still deeply embedded in American society. They keep quoting Dr. King, talking about a colorblind society. We're not colorblind yet. We haven't created the beloved community, the open society. So when I was working on the speech, I said in the statement that the Republican proposal is not the Holocaust, but I said I must speak out. And I quoted the German theologian, Martin, saying they're coming. They're coming for the children, for the elderly, for the disabled. And the contract and what we did is going to have a major impact on children, on women, on the elderly, on the disabled. I agree with you when you refer to the Holocaust. It's even to this day, when I travel to Israel or travel to some parts of Europe and talk with people in Atlanta, survivors of the Holocaust, it boggles my mind. I don't understand how it happened. I still don't what happened. And I know we say it cannot happen here. But in Washington today, this is my 5th term, starting my 9th year, it is a mean spirit. It is a mean spirit. Well, people are insensitive. And you have to find a way to dramatize the issue, to educate people, to sensitize people. That's what I tried to do.
Let me respond, because I didn't agree with any reference to the Holocaust in that context, and I think people overuse it, but it's used on all sides. And I disagree with the first part of your question. No, I do not regard this as a well-intentioned effort. I think this is I think it's 2 members of the Republican Party on the floor of the House compared poor people to animals.
Alligators and wolves.
And wolves. One member of the Republican Party, John Micah, got up holding a sign that said, in support of legislation that will lead to 2- and 3-year-olds having no income whatsoever. And that's conceded. That's going to be, in some cases, that'll happen. He was holding a sign that said, "Do not feed the alligators." And he said, you know, when you feed the alligators, they become too complacent, and all they want to do is sit around and be fed. And then Congresswoman Chenoweth from Wyoming or Idaho.
No. It was Barbara Cuban.
Cuban from Wyoming. Wyoming.
With a red dress on.
Yes, it's what.
Talking about wolves.
Little
Miss Red Riding Hood.
I will confess to being a little bit soft on that. It's what Kate Clinton, the comedian, says. She describes them as the rectangular states, and I get them confused when you're doing the puzzle. But she said, well, you know, it's like the wolves. We fed the wolves, and they don't want to come out of their cages. Now, there were 2 members of the Republican Party with no rebuke from their side comparing poor people to animals, saying that you make public policy by analogizing to people who have no human spirit, who have no concern for their young, who have no particular initiative, who may not have been the victim of bad circumstances, but who are simply a bundle of instincts, and who, if you can feed them for nothing, they'll have no responses. So, yeah, a lot of anger was generated on both sides. But George Will, an intellectually honest conservative, had a column shortly before that said, if you want to reform welfare because you want to make people better, you can't save money. It costs you more money. Jim Wilson, James Q. Wilson, formerly of Harvard, now on the West Coast, has said the same thing. If, in fact, your motivation in reforming a flawed welfare system is to diminish the bad effects it has on people, that's going to cost you more money in the short term. But that wasn't the Republican approach. Their approach was to save a lot of money. And I regard that, given what Wilson said and given what Will said, as not at all well-intentioned. I regarded that as an unfair attack on the poor people. So no, I don't think people should talk about the Holocaust, but I don't regard this as a good faith effort either.
Let me take a segue off of Barney's comments, Mr. Simon. Let me see if I can demonstrate for you that it may not have come to the floor with the best of intentions, by putting to you, if you, and I'm now just asking the question, if you agree with the premise that welfare ought to be reformed, and I don't believe that there's anyone who does not agree with that premise, and if you agree that there are things that are positive that can be done, that can bring people to a work ethic better than what has been done up to now in the area of welfare. And if you believe that we should have tax cuts, and if you believe that those tax cuts have to have correlative spending cuts, and you're in charge now, you're the president with the line item veto, you're the Speaker of the House, or you're all of the Congress, would you start your cutting on the most vulnerable people in our society? No. End of story.
I think for a minute he thought he was back in class, Alcy. That's what they sound like a case study for the Kennedy
School. End of story. They started with the most vulnerable. Their damned intentions were no good, and John may not correctly have invoked the Holocaust, but I have news for you. If you're going to damage the vulnerable, it's a matter of time before there's someone just a little above the vulnerable that you're going to damage. It was unfair, it was unwarranted, and it was not well-intentioned. It was mean-spirited, and you rethink whether or not you ought to stay a Republican.
I've been given a note saying that we really will have to end the forum now. I'm sure that the speakers will be here for a few more minutes, but we have to end. And so I'd like to, I think there's a revolt brewing here.
Answer real quick.
I tell you what,
It's our fault.
would this be,
We've been speaking too long.
okay, well, let's do this then. With all the people who wanted to ask questions, we'd like to get them all, and then we'll give each of you 1 minute to respond.
We can do that.
All right, fine. Let's do it that way.
Okay, my name is Dennis Jean-Jacques. I'm an investment analyst at a local investment firm in Boston. I also belong to a group called Bridges, which is a group of young African-American, Jewish-American young professionals and get together. A lot of them are here today, and I'm going to be at a first year at the Harvard Business School next year. My question is about economic power, and I would just like to know where the blacks and Jews stood in regards to the economic imbalance between the African American community and other communities. Specifically, if you could comment on, I guess a couple months ago when I guess it was the House that voted down a deal between Viacom and another African American purchaser, and I just want to kind of get your viewpoint on that. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, your question.
My name is Kim Patilla. I'm a junior at the college, and although I find the similarities and the points on which we can converge in black-Jewish relations very important, I'd also like to ask a question about how we might mediate some of the differences. Here on the college campus, probably the most divisive issue has been the BSA's willingness to give a hearing to the Nation of Islam. Perhaps the national equivalent of that might be the NAACP's willingness to meet with Farrakhan. I was wondering how the black-Jewish relations have weathered that in the Congress and what lessons we might have to learn from your experience.
Good evening. My name is Nathaniel Klitzberg. I'm a student of Afro-American Studies at Tufts University, and I'm also a member of Representative Hastings District. And it's nice to see you so calm this evening.
Well, you know my reputation.
Very well so. I'm just completing a thesis on black-Jewish relations in New York City, and unfortunately, New York City seems to be a generalization for black-Jewish relations in the country. And to the Congress people, I'd just like to know how the relations in New York City between blacks and Jews has affected you and your districts. And to Mr. Zakim, why is it that with all of the talk of a black-Jewish coalition and the need for coalitions, that the Jewish press, from Tikkun on the left to commentary on the right, continually use New York City to generalize for the nation, which is obviously incorrect because the issues facing New York are not the issues in South Florida or Atlanta or Boston.
Okay, we'll hear now final comments from the
Let me go
panelists.
quickly. First, on the the Viacom deal, which is part of the affirmative action thing, Jim McDermott, a congressman, offered a compromise that would have preserved a lot of this transfer right. It would have cleaned it up some. My guess is that got the vote of you would have comparable statistics to what John said, 85% of the Jewish members and 90+% of the black members. And in fact, when you talk about economic power, again, the tax bill and other things were there. I think on economic issues, it's pretty similar. And specifically on the Viacom deal, we voted for McDermott's thing. On the second one, on the question of and I think this is one of the toughest issues, what do you do about the willingness of the black students to listen to Jeffries, et cetera? One problem we have is Jews have expected blacks to be stronger in denouncing black extremists. And straight people think gay people should be stronger in denouncing crazy gay people. And a number of Christians wondered why some Jews weren't more critical of Ariel Sharon in Israel. And the answer is, and I agree with all of them, by the way, and I have been critical of all elements of that, most people don't like to criticize their own. I wish it were different, but it's not a particularly black thing. People make the mistaken view that if they criticize their own extremists, they'll be putting ammunition in the hands of their enemies. I think that is generally wrong. If you don't criticize your extremists, you wind up getting tagged with them. I understand that sensitivity. I think it is wrong. I think people in general ought to be more willing to criticize. But I can tell you as a gay man that when I talk about lunatic activity on the part of lesbians and gays, people bristle and say, well, you're right, but don't say it. And within the Jewish community, I have heard people say, Shah, not in front of the Goyim. You're right, but don't let them hear it. So I agree. Don't take that as acquiescence. And the second thing is, people ought to say you have a right to ask people to express disagreement with what they say. But I think it is wrong if you say they shouldn't come. And let me repeat, a little bit cleaned up, what I said before. Free speech exists for obnoxious jerks. Because if you're not an obnoxious jerk, no one's going to try and shut you up. So automatically, anytime a question comes up of free speech, you are defending free speech on behalf of someone you'd like to slap. And the demand should not be that you don't let this one or that one speak. Yes, you have a right to ask people to differentiate themselves from obnoxious views and criticize those views. And I wish more blacks did this with Leonard Jeffries, and I wish more Jews had done this with Ariel Sharon, and I wish more other groups did it with regard to other groups. People have this reluctance to criticize their own. It's morally wrong and tactically wrong, but it's an unfortunately shared characteristic.
The statistics will reflect that the same percentages you've heard bandied about this evening on the subject of economic empowerment. Blacks and Jews align themselves very much the same for economic development and empowerment for African Americans. Unfortunately, we are caught in budget warps all over the place, and most times when we submit what is called the alternative budget, which is a more progressive budget, almost all of the blacks support it, and the great majority of the Jews do as well.
Congressman Lewis?
I don't think I can add anything to what my two colleagues have already stated in the Congress. I don't know what the rule that we would use. Just 1 minute. I can't do a 1 minute. You know, being from the South, it take us 1 minute to get warm up. So
you can revise and extend.
I can revise and extend my remark in support of the statement of these two guys.
Mr. Zakim.
Okay. On the issue of the New York press, I'd say it reminds me of Woody Allen's famous joke that if you combine commentary and dissent, you get dysentery. And I think that one could be same with respect to Tikkun. There's a famous poster of New York that sees the New York view of the world, and it stops, I think, at Fifth Avenue. I think the world has to be reminded that this country is neither black nor Jewish, so a lot of our debate may not be of great concern to a lot of other Americans, and I think the same thing about New York, which thinks that it sets the path and the pace for the rest of the country, and I don't think it does. I think, in fact, what we have is many case studies where Jews and Jews in New York don't agree, and blacks in New York don't agree, and then we get attached to all of us as if we suddenly have to defend the whole group.
And to some extent, it's the narcissism of small differences that gets played out among intellectuals in this sort of a situation.
You mean to tell me if the sparrow falls, it really ain't going to fall in New York?
Well, I may not get through the pollution. I just want to say one thing on the issue of speaking, since we take a pretty strong position on that. I think it's pretty fair to say that we, as Jews concerned about anti-Semitism, etc., have got to be very clear that we don't fear extremist speakers on campus. We don't have to be afraid that other people are going to listen to what they say. But I think in the true tradition of consumer protection, that it would be important for people to understand that these should be viewed as an opportunity to really question what these speakers say. And on an academic premise or academic forum in particular, what always concerns me is the willingness on the part of people to accept whatever many speakers say. And I think that if you invite a controversial speaker, whether you're black or Jewish, if that decision, controversial as it may be, provokes some legitimate criticism, which is the expression of free speech by people who are concerned about it, that shouldn't be confused with censorship. And I think that people willing to take the leap and invite extremist speakers should be also willing to have a reasonable debate with a factual foundation of the sort that I, at least in my opening remarks, talked about the need to cut through the myths and misinformation, which I think was partly accomplished tonight by these leaders here. And I think that this whole debate about extremist speakers leads people into many, many detours and leads them away from the consensus that we need to come up with in this country, because there are, to be redundant a second, there are many people who think that the best way to disrupt the social consensus in this country is to divide blacks and Jews against each other. It's not enough that people hate us both equally for us to have an alliance. But we also have to understand that there are some people who do. We have to have an alliance based on what we share in a positive way, and I think a lot of the issues we talked about tonight are part of those reasons for that alliance.
Since the gentleman from Boston said what he said, I take back 30 seconds of my 1 minute.
Parliamentary inquiry.
I think it's right. I believe in freedom of speech. You must have free speech. But anytime someone speak words of hate, I think we have a moral obligation to speak out. When someone speaks words of bigotry, racism, or anti-Semitism. See, George Wallace, who in another period in our recent history, traveled around the country speaking. He never pulled the trigger. He didn't throw the bomb that killed the 4 little girls in Birmingham. He didn't pull the trigger that killed McEvers in June 1963 in Mississippi, or the 3 civil rights workers in June of 1964 in Mississippi. But he helped to create the climate, create the environment for other people to do it. And that's why I think you have to be on guard when you have people speaking words of hate and racism, bigotry, and anti-Semitism.
I'd like to thank each of our panelists, and I'd also like to thank the audience for being so attentive. Thank you.